Hey everyone, it's Chris Mooney, and we are here for the final round of GDS3, round 5. You can find my videos for the other rounds up there. Let's get into it. To recap where we've been so far, my journey through the GDS3 was a bit of a roller coaster, you could say. Each week I seemed to bounce up and down in the rankings. In the previous challenge, I came in 3rd out of 5. Third's not bad, but it definitely wasn't a safe position. Last week, Mark Rosewater told me to pull out all the stops, which I knew was going to be pretty difficult because this week, as part of my booster pack, I was going to have to make 10 commons. Finally, the main lesson I took away from last week was to ask the judges for help. Just ask some basic clarifying questions so that I wouldn't get caught on any technicalities. And that turned out to be a pretty big deal this week. For this challenge, what we had to do was pick a set and then design a booster pack's worth of cards that would fit into that set. Because everything you designed had to fit into a set, choosing what set you were going to design for was a big deal. When I got around to choosing a set, there were 3 major criteria that I was looking for. The first criteria was that it had to be easy to make commons for that set. Since that was going to take up the brunt of the work this week, and it was going to be the hardest part of the challenge, I really wanted to make sure that I chose something that I thought was going to be easy to design commons for. That meant that I wanted it to have keywords that were easy to use at common and had a lot of open design space. I wanted there to be a lot of mechanical themes in the set that I could design cards around. And I was hoping that there would be a lot of unexplored space at common so that I didn't feel like I was retreading the same stuff that the real set did. The second criteria was strong flavor. And lastly, I wanted to pick a set that I enjoyed. That wasn't necessary, but I felt like if I was going to spend 4 days knee-deep in whatever set I picked, I wanted it to be something that I actually liked playing. So there were 3 sets that I ended up with that ended up being my top 3 choices. One of those sets was Innistrad. Innistrad is probably my favorite set of all time. It has awesome flavor, super resonant. You can do tons of things with that. In the end, I realized that I didn't think that I was going to be able to make 10 commons from Innistrad. There just weren't that many keywords to utilize, and there wasn't a lot of space left unexplored by the themes of Innistrad. Innistrad is a pretty good set, and it doesn't really seem like it's missing anything. That's why I actually decided to put Shadows over Innistrad on my list over the original. Shadows over Innistrad has many more keywords to work with at common, and a lot more nitty-gritty mechanical themes that you can design around. Overall, I felt like if I was going to get stuck with one of the Innistrads, that Shadows over Innistrad was going to be much easier to work with. The other set that made my list but didn't get the number 1 spot was Khans of Tarkir. Khans of Tarkir is probably my second favorite set of all time, and it has tons of material to work with. You have Morph, which is super flexible. You have multicolor cards at common, and obviously what comes with that is cards with off-color abilities. So already that's a lot of design space that you can use. But on top of that, the set also has 5 other keywords that exist at common, and they're all pretty simple, which means that you could very easily use all of this material to create a good booster pack worth of commons. The reason why this didn't make the top spot was that I actually felt like I couldn't add anything to the set without throwing it off. Maybe more than any other recent set, Khans of Tarkir is built very specifically around a lot of cycles, and so adding new cards to that would sort of throw off the balance. So finally, I arrived at the set that I put on the top of my list, which was Guild Pact. Guild Pact fit into all of the criteria that I was looking for. First, Guild Pact seemed like an easy set to make commons for. It had 3 keywords, one that was good but horribly misexecuted, one that was medium with some potential left over, and one rock-solid mechanic that had already been brought back once and sort of proved that it could pull its own weight. There were a bunch of mechanical themes at common. There were multicolor cards for each of the 3 guilds that had their own mechanical themes. There were hybrid cards. There were monocolored cards with off-color activated abilities. And there was an enchantment sub-theme that continued from the previous set. There's also a lot of unexplored space at common. Guild Pact was made under the wonky old small set system where all 3 rarities got the same number of cards. So that means that Guild Pact only had 55 commons total. So that seemed like there's going to be a lot of unmined potential in there. Additionally, Guild Pact had strong flavor. Ravnica is one of the strongest flavor sets that we have. And the 3 guilds that were inside of Guild Pact all had super resonant, super fun identities. Additionally, being set on Ravnica gave you access to the other guilds. Plus, something that wasn't really explored in the original Ravnica block that was touched upon in Return to Ravnica was the city flavor. Making cards that only really felt at home at a city, which, is Ravnica's identity that sets it apart from other planes of the multiverse. Lastly, Guild Pact was a set that had a special place in my heart. When I started playing Magic, I started with a Guild Pact intro deck, the Is It Gizmometry deck. And that deck has stuck with me ever since then. It is what got me into the game. It got me to love Magic. Obviously, it was so important that I chose Gelectrode as my avatar for this challenge. So I knew that I was going to feel right at home if I got Guild Pact. And lucky for me, no one else picked the original Ravnica block, so Guild Pact was mine. So the last thing that I want to touch on is following up on the lesson from last time, asking questions. I came into this challenge really not wanting to get caught on any technicalities again. I was tired of being dinged for things that I easily could have asked about. So this time I decided I was going to ask any question that I could possibly have. So right after we got the challenge, I emailed Mark Rosewater right back to ask him a bunch of questions. First, I was wondering about new vocabulary. So these cards are supposed to feel like an older set, but does that mean we have to use old words? Can we use die? Can we use exile? I also asked about breaking from the set's conventions. As a Ravnica set, Guild Pact had a lot of cycles. Was I going to be upholden to those? If I introduced a card that would only make sense as a part of a cycle, was I going to get dinged for that? Every haunt card in Guild Pact used an enter the battlefield and death trigger, so I asked, could I break away from that? I also asked about the replicate cost. Every replicate card in Guild Pact had an equal replicate cost and mana cost. Could I break that convention as well? The answer to all of these was essentially yes, you're good to go. I also asked about designing for a modern, limited environment. I actually went back and playtested a lot of my cards with original cards from Guild Pact, and it became pretty obvious that everything I made was way too strong for that older format. The creatures were all super small, very defensive, the removal spells were super inefficient, so I wanted to know if I could use modern standards for that, which I could. So I just want to give a big thanks to Mark Rosewater for answering all of those questions and putting up with me for that day. It did take a while to pick my set, and I knew that he was getting kind of worried, but I think it worked out in the end. So the first mechanic that I dug into was Haunt. The actual rules text for Haunt is pretty simple and evocative. It was just the enters the battlefield and death trigger part that made the cards too confusing to work with. Because of this, Haunt is a pretty common rescue mechanic for custom designers. I'm definitely not the first person to ever think, hey, Haunt would be really easy to improve. In fact, I'm pretty sure that a number of my fellow competitors wrote about Haunt in their intro essays as the mechanic that would be the best to bring back and revive. The problems with Haunt were pretty clearly rooted in the execution of the mechanic. All Haunt creatures have an ability that triggers when they enter the battlefield and when the creature that they haunt dies. And that's really hard to grasp. There's such a huge time difference from when your creature enters the battlefield, it dies, it haunts another creature, and then that creature dies, that it's really hard to keep track of. Not to mention the fact that many Haunt cards had abilities that were going to drastically change the outcome of a creature dying, potentially killing one or more other cards. On top of that, Haunt was weirdly used on spells. I'm not really sure why Haunt was put on spells, especially when there were only 3 Haunt spells total, but that just added to the confusion. There were lots of directions to go with Haunt. One thing was to just unify the triggers. So have your Haunt triggers happen when your creature died, and then when the creature that it haunted died. Not only would that make it a lot simpler to understand, but it would also let you build around it a lot easier. The second thing you could do was go the bestow route. Your creature would die, it would haunt another creature, and it would give that creature some sort of bonus or detriment. The last thing you could do is you could refer to haunted creatures the same way that we refer to enchanted creatures or equipped creatures. So I took those ideas and I started experimenting. I tried to make a couple more haunt spells, but in the end, I realized that with only one booster pack, there wasn't really a need to worry about them, so I was just going to pretend like they didn't exist. The second thing that I looked into was the death triggers, which were fine, and I think would definitely be a serviceable fix, but they just weren't really grabbing me, they weren't really interesting. Even though I thought it was a good idea, I set it aside. The final thing I figured out that I wanted to avoid was changing the size of a creature. I felt like affecting a creature's power and toughness was going to feel too much like an aura, and that put Haunt too close to Bestow. So I decided that all of my Haunt creatures weren't going to give power or toughness, they were all going to do some other ability, and that would also open up the door for more negative effects. So the first Haunt card that I settled on was Tormented Thrall. This was a pretty simple design. I wrote this card down and it never really changed throughout all of design. I was definitely a little concerned about the fact that making a creature not block wasn't necessarily black. We have gotten that effect on black auras in the past, but not that many of them, so I knew that it was going to be a little bit of a stretch. Maybe if I made this card again, I would go with a slightly different effect, like maybe something like you can't block alone, so it feels more like connected to Menace, which is very clearly a black thing, but all in all, I think that this card still does a good job of showing how Haunt could be used. The second card that I settled on for Haunt was Dutiful Debtor. The idea for this card came from me researching which keywords were not available for me to use anymore, since that was one of the rules of the challenge. One of the ones that came up was lifelink. Lifelink didn't exist. At this time, it was still worded out. It was still written out as a full line of text. This is an ability that we refer to as Spirit Link, and one of the things that Spirit Link does is it allows you to put it on your creature to get a lifelink effect, or your opponent's creature to be a really soft removal spell. So I thought that putting this ability on a Haunt creature would create a nice dual-purpose card. You could boost up one of your other creatures to gain a ton of life, or you could basically lock down one of your opponent's creatures. One of the Haunt cards that didn't make the set was this one, Orsov Tapper. The idea here was based obviously on the new card Drudge Sentinel. On your creature, the tap was a downside. But if you put it on your opponent's creature, you could use that tap as an upside. I really liked this idea, I really attached hard into it, but after playtesting it a couple of times, it became pretty obvious that this card wasn't as cool as I thought. Just in general, an ability that prevents your creature from dying doesn't go well with Haunt, an ability that literally requires your creature to die. So even though it was kind of a clever use of a new effect, ultimately it didn't play well enough to justify the cleverness, which is a common problem for me. Lastly, we have Basilica Recruit, who is the only survivor from the Haunted theme. I really like this idea of taking the set's inherent enchantment theme and then just tying it to Haunt, since they were kind of similar flavorfully and mechanically. Any of the cards that wanted to be enchanted, if they also said Haunted, then it would give us a unique effect that could only exist in this set in two different ways. Originally, this card gained a lifelink when it was enchanted or haunted, but in my research I remembered I can't use lifelink. So that's when it changed to First Strike, which also gave the card a bit more flavor and I think ultimately plays better. I actually came up with a couple other cards that played into this space, but most of them ended up uncommon. And for this challenge, we had so many more common slots that any idea that could be represented on a common got put on a common. Next, we have Replicate. Replicate is a simple and versatile ability, but the cards that it went on were all pretty underwhelming. One of the reasons that I love Replicate as an ability is that it allows for creativity. In my opinion, the best Replicate cards are the cards that allow you to get different effects if you double up targeting the same thing or if you split your targets up. Unfortunately, there weren't that many Replicate cards that did that, which leads into the next two problems I'm about to talk about. The first problem is what I call the Strive problem. Basically, all the Replicate does is let you target more things. And that's not a bad ability, but it is kind of boring. I mean, we got Overload in Return to Ravnica, which is that turned up to a much higher degree. So it leaves the Strive version of Replicate feeling very underwhelming. The other problem is the Echo problem. Every Replicate card's Replicate cost was exactly the same as its casting cost. That made them easy to remember, but it cut down a lot on the different types of effects that you could have. Eventually, Echo was errated to put a mana cost on it. That meant that new Echo cards could use a Echo cost that was completely different from the mana cost. Replicate already had this ability, but it was never used, so that was something that I wanted to tap into. Shrink Warp is an experiment in creating more Replicate cards where doubling up on a target is important. In this case, Shrink Warp can only bounce small creatures unless you replicate it and double target the same thing. There were a couple of other designs that I came up with, like this card Lockdown, but a lot of them ended up feeling very similar to existing Replicate cards, whereas Shrink Warp felt pretty different. Even from Vacuum Melt, which is another Replicate bounce spell, Shrink Warp functions very differently. I knew that Shrink Warp was pushing the bounds just a little bit. I think in terms of power level and impact, it's not hugely outside of what a common might be able to do, but really the problem is more with the math. Somebody trying to figure out how to use this spell, even though it opens up a lot of room for creativity, it also opens up a lot of room for confusion and analysis paralysis. I think that Shrink Warp would probably be fine if it was the most complicated common in the entire set, but unfortunately I have more complicated cards in this booster pack, so that meant that it didn't really pass the cut. My other Replicate card is Lightning Round. Lightning Round started as a pretty simple concept. What sort of costs can be put on Replicate to create interesting effects? I agree with the judges that Lightning Round would be a lot safer if it did have a mana cost attached to the exiling effect, but in playtesting we really wanted to make sure that Lightning Round played significantly different from Pyromatics. In hindsight, maybe it wouldn't have been brought up, but then again, Shrink Warp plays pretty differently from Vacuum Melt, and Eric called me out on that one. So even though play design would probably change this to have a mana cost, I think submitting it as a concept without one further emphasizes how different this is from a normal Replicate spell. There were a couple of other designs that used alternative Replicate costs. For instance, this card, Start From Scratch, used the modern red Rummaging ability, but tied it into the Replicate cost. Ultimately, Lightning Round was the most fun and most interesting of these cards, but some of these other ones could have made the cut if I had remembered to put my extra common in the pack instead of an island. Finally, we have Bloodthirst. Bloodthirst was pretty straightforward, as you would expect Gruul to be. Bloodthirst had already been done twice. I didn't really want to reinvent the wheel or do anything super crazy, but I did want to create Bloodthirst cards that were playable without the Bloodthirst counter. The Bloodthirst 1 cards were almost all castable without the effect, but once you got up to Bloodthirst 2 or 3 or even higher, you basically would never cast the creature without the Bloodthirst, and that never created interesting gameplay decisions. Again, this is Gruul, so it's not like we have to have super complicated creative decision making, but at the same time, you want your cards to at least do something, even if you can't Bloodthirst them. A simple way of making the counter matter, but not be the entire point of the card, was to create effects that cared about power and toughness, since the creature would obviously have power or toughness, regardless of if it had the counter or not. Scab Gunslinger was the first card that I created in this design, and it basically never changed. It's very simple, very straightforward. In playtesting, we discovered that it was even better than we thought, because I actually didn't realize how useful it was to deal that extra point of damage, non-combat damage, even without the Bloodthirst, because it enabled your other Bloodthirst cards. Hexhide Beast was an experiment in me trying to create a softer version of Hexproof. I succeeded in that, but not really in a way that was acceptable for a common. I actually did create a couple of other cards, for instance, Shielded Worm, that had a much more straightforward version of this ability, but again, I was really focused on making cards that would still have an effect without the counter. Maybe I shouldn't have tried so hard, maybe I should have gone for something simpler, but at the end of the day, Hexhide Beast's soft version of Hexproof was a lot more fun to play with and play around than a traditional Hexproof effect. Additionally, in my design process, I created a couple of cards that sort of worked alongside Bloodthirst. I liked the idea of making green cards that cared about +1/+1 counters, because they would also play with Simic in the next set. None of them really made the cut, but again, if I hadn't left that last common out, maybe we would have seen one of them. Now we'll move on to the rest of my cards not connected to one of the set's mechanics. First up is Right of Way. Right of Way started out as this card. It tapped all creatures that weren't enchanted, which included your own. So it basically gave you one shot of sneaking your creature through and dealing a bunch of damage, but we could never really get this effect to play out in a way that was common appropriate. In order to get it down to be a common, I decided that I had to pick. Either we had to stick with this top-down flavor of Right of Way, or we had to make this an enchantment build-around card. And I decided that an enchantment build-around card was going to work better. Guild Pact has a decent amount of enchantment interaction at common, especially for a set that only has 55 commons. There are a couple of commons that care about enchantments, most notably the Mage Mark cycle, which is in Guild Pact and not in Dissension. This theme was continuing on from the previous set, so I felt like it was going to be a safe environment to explore at common in this set. I didn't feel like I was really introducing anything new to the set, only playing on themes that already existed at common. If I were going to make this card again, I would probably go for something a little bit closer to Grasp of the Hieromancer. Still keep the flavor, but focus the ability so that it didn't require counting up of enchantments. Next we have Regulate. Regulate is another card that was focused on the urban flavor of Ravnica. So Regulate started out as a card called Dissension, or a couple of cards called Dissension. I thought that it was pretty cute to create a card called Dissension that specifically was better against multicolored cards, but unfortunately, it just didn't feel right at common. Usually we hose the set theme at uncommon or higher, but having a common that did it just felt wrong. It felt like it was punishing you for doing the thing that the set wanted you to do. That's when we switched over to Regulate. We changed the effect to be better if you were multicolored, and then switched the flavor up to be more about the guilds impressing their will on others. I didn't think that this card was going to be too much of a problem for common. In the past couple of sets, we've had other common counterspells that had about the same amount of math involved, but it is true that Guild Pact didn't have a multicolor theme. The only set in the original Ravnica block that had a multicolor theme was Dissension, so I can see that Regulate is adding a new aspect to Guild Pact Limited that didn't exist there before. Lastly, the flavor does feel pretty Azorius, but every set in the Ravnica block has cards flavored around guilds that aren't in that set. It's part of what makes Ravnica cool, that the whole city exists, even if your guilds aren't the ones being highlighted in that set. So it didn't feel too off. Plus, we tried to make the flavor text lean more towards any guild as opposed to specifically Azorius, even though the name definitely feels closer to them. Slager Challenger, I'll admit, this is the card that I was for sure was an uncommon and shouldn't be a common, but honestly, this was a card that I threw in at the very last second, and that's why I just decided to take the hit on the rarity here. What used to be in the slot was a card called Boastful Brawler, which I liked because it played into the idea of Gruul wants to have big creatures. This creature gets bigger if you have creatures that are bigger than it. As we were heading into Sunday night, we realized that this card is just a way worse Brazen Wolves. And I mean, we could have changed the design, but overall, it just wasn't that exciting. It wasn't very creative, and it definitely wasn't pulling out all the stops like I was told. The idea for Flagrant Challenger just popped into my head. I wrote it down, and I submitted it. Obviously, in hindsight, I would either try and find a way to water this ability down. Maybe you have to pay some mana to make it happen. Maybe you just make the creature a lot smaller so it's less impactful. I think there are a couple of ways you could tweak this ability to make it common, or obviously just make the card an uncommon where it's probably fine. When I submitted these cards, I wasn't expecting that so many of them would be tagged as actually uncommon, so I thought that putting one card in here that was definitely uncommon wouldn't be too big of a deal, but unfortunately it just added on top of the pile and made my uncommon common problems even worse. Goblin Prodigy was inspired by an earlier replicate design I had, which was this card called Burst of Inspiration. Since I hadn't made any Is It creatures yet, I decided that I would try this ability on a creature. This was a slight tweak on the temporary draw idea. Unfortunately, it just sort of ended up playing like a normal draw card, so then I decided, hey, what if we just took that original ability and made you sacrifice the creature for it? That way you're only going to be gaining one card advantage, even if you cast both spells, and sometimes you don't even cast any spells. That definitely felt a lot more Is It, and it played out very exciting. We decided to keep this card, re-flavor it to use more of Goblin Genius's flavor, and that's what I ended up submitting. Even though we only currently see this ability at higher rarities, it's still relatively young in its magic lifespan, and I wouldn't be surprised that one day down the line we do see this appearing at common, but very, very rarely. Indemnity started out as a card called Pay Penance. Pay Penance was a Punisher card that asked your opponent to pay life or lose a creature that hit you. It was really fun to cast on your opponent's bomb or fatty to just either drain him for a whole bunch or to kill their creature outright for 1 mana, but it never worked on small to medium creatures. Eventually I decided it was going to work better as just a more reliable removal spell, and that's where Indemnity comes in. I personally really like when Orzhov flavor dips more into the sort of corporate, banking, mafia side of things. Any planet can have a corrupt church, or reanimation, or spirits. So in general, I enjoy when Orzhov flavor dips more into catching people in contracts and abusing loopholes in the fine print. It does bleed a little bit into Azorius flavor, but the Azorius are more about actually upholding the rules, whereas the Orzhov only create rules to abuse them. Death Collector might be the only card in the set that I created long before this challenge existed. The first time that I saw this wording of exiling a creature until this creature leaves the battlefield, I thought, hey, we could do that with all sorts of stuff, like reanimation, for instance. The fact that the reanimation was temporary and conditional really helped play this card up as white, so I felt like when I got the chance to design for Orzhov that this was going to be a natural fit. It's funny that despite playtesting with this card quite a bit, we never caught the looping ability. It seems pretty obvious, but I think in playtesting every time we cast it we always just grabbed the biggest creature and didn't even think about the fact that we could be grabbing more Death Collectors just to get free 2/2s. If I was going to change this card to avoid that loop, I think I would actually go with the Restoration Angel or the Glorybringer approach. Just make it revive non-clerics or something. And now you have a card that hasn't really changed functionality that much, except that it prevents the loop in a somewhat flavorful, or at least less mechanically overt way. Finally, my last card is Street Tiller Sage. Based on the layout of the pack, which had at that point been pretty close to final, I realized that Gruul had the least number of cards, and thus I wanted to have a Gruul rare. I had a big brainstorming push where I just wrote down as many green-red rare ideas as I could. Some of them were good, some of them weren't. One of them really caught my eye though, which was this one, Violent Appeal. I liked it, but I didn't like how it required you to deal damage. In general, Magic is really starting to lean away from cards that are only able to be cast under certain circumstances. Plus, it really came off as a win more card. So I started to brainstorm other ways that this card could work. Scent of Blood used a pretty interesting idea of there's an X on this card, and the X is set to a minimum, but could go higher if you did something. Ultimately, this one played pretty well, but it was awkward. We could never really get the minimum to feel good. So next we tried it with an X. You cast it for X, which is pretty common for this type of spell, but then it basically gave the creature Bloodthirst by putting X plus or plus 1 counters on it if you dealt damage. This helped it feel a lot more Gruul, but the more we played with it, the more it was starting to feel too close to other cards that existed. Grabbing a creature off the top of your library was pretty standard fare for green rare, and even though this card was red and added in a very red feeling ability, I was looking for something that was a little bit more inspired, so I went back to the drawing board. That's when I came up with this card, Wheeler. Once we played with this card, we were sold immediately. One of the things I really liked about it was that if you got in and got to draw 6 or 7 cards, you now had to think about whether or not you wanted to attack again. Were you ready to discard your entire hand? Were you going to be able to cast enough spells before your next attack step? Were you just okay going through your deck? Were you going to mill out if you ended up not being able to close the game out fast enough? Created a lot of interesting effects, while still feeling super Gruul, must die, smash, we eat. During playtesting, it felt like there wasn't enough risk for such a high payoff. Oftentimes, Wheeler was trading for 2 creatures and drawing 3 cards, and that seemed just a little bit too strong. So we decided that by making you discard your hand on the attack, it added a lot more risk. Ultimately, maybe I could have stayed with the safer wording. Maybe this effect isn't as strong as it showed up in our playtesting, but who knows? That would be something that play design would probably help figure out. Finally, shout out to Ken Nagel, our guest judge for this week. Most of the time, I don't let any knowledge of the guest judges seep through into my designs, but I did remember one thing about Ken, and that was that he liked fatties. So I felt like if I made a booster pack that didn't include any giant creatures, that I would just be letting him down. So that definitely played a little bit into my decision to put Street Tiller Sage into my booster pack. So overall, the judges really liked my cards, except for the fact that so many of them were uncommons instead of commons. This has been a constant running problem for me, and it's clearly the part of Magic design that I feel like I have to work on the most. I tried really hard in this challenge to keep all of my common cards interesting, unique, and creative, but still within the boundaries of what makes a common. Some of them were more on the borderline, much closer to common than uncommon, but there were far too many of those and they started to draw attention to themselves. Each Magic set probably only gets a handful of cards that are slightly too complicated for common, but are allowed anyway. But this booster pack contained way too many of those. Any one of my commons could probably be okay on their own, but once you put them all together, it just overloads the whole thing. I'm glad that my ideas were able to shine through and pull me through into the top 3, even despite me missing so hard on the rarities. Even though I'm 3rd place in this round, which is technically not that high out of 4, I still think that this is my best performance of the entire challenge. Very few of my cards have the same problems that I had when I started out, with tracking issues, memory issues, complexity issues. Yeah, there are still a few problems, but not nearly to the same degree and much closer to being printable, which is, I think, why the judges still liked my cards despite, the issues with the rarities. Thank you all so much for watching. I cannot express how much I appreciate your support that you've given me throughout all of these weeks. For the first time, I don't know what happens next. In a couple of days, I'm going to fly up to Renton to compete live in the final top 3 challenge, and we'll see what happens after that. But thank you all so much for watching. I also want to take this time to thank all of the people who helped me through this process. My playtesting team, DJ Shea, Vincent Bertoni, and River Jackson. They set time aside whenever they could to help me playtest my cards, and I'm super thankful. I could not have done it without them. Also, thank you to my family who supported me through the whole thing and helped me out. Thank you to my partner, Maggie Lai, for helping me in any way that she could while I was stressing out about these challenges. And thank you to all of you out there who have been leaving me comments on YouTube, on Twitter, on Reddit. Thank you for your support. I promise you that I will do you proud up there in the top 3 challenge. Thanks for watching my coverage of the GDS3. It's been the most confusing, stressful, but most exhilarating and most fun that I've had in quite a long time. And I can't wait to see what happens next. Thanks for watching.